Well, good morning or good afternoon, whenever you may be opting to watch this. This week we will be working on Module 2 in Stephen Ministry, and I want to ask you to just close your eyes for a moment, wherever you are, and imagine a life without feelings. Okay, so you got your eyes closed? Let me ask you a couple of questions. What would your relationship be like without feelings, without love, without desire, without affection? What would work be like if you never felt satisfaction at a job well done? How would you decide what to do with your time if you didn't enjoy some activities and not enjoy other activities? Would you eat if you never felt hungry? Or would you receive pleasure from eating or pain from starvation if you did not know what those feelings were like? Well, if you did that, if you closed your eyes, I'm going to ask you to open them now and reflect on the fact that living without feelings would be like seeing the world as a flat, two-dimensional black and white image, much like this table I'm sitting on. Life would be colorless, void of meaning. I doubt that humankind would even survive without feelings, but God has given us feelings. He created us as people who are sometimes happy, sometimes sad. As you did your pre-class reading for this week, you saw a wide variety of feelings that people can have. On page 22 in your reading, it talked about the different kinds and the different feelings. Page 25, what primary and secondary feelings look like. Well, sometimes those feelings are enjoyable, but other times they're very painful. But in either case, people benefit from having someone to share their feelings with. Some care receivers can be afraid of their painful feelings, that they push down or suppress all of their feelings in order to avoid the painful ones. This can cause them to miss out on many of the wonderful feelings that can come. Trying to stifle feelings can also cause those feelings to come out in other ways that become uncomfortable and difficult to control and to manage. Other care receivers don't try to stop up the feelings. They experience them in their full force. When others see that the care receivers are terribly sad or angry, they may tend to, as a caregiver, keep their distance, which then leaves the care receiver to suffer through their feelings alone. It can take a lot of courage for people to face their feelings, but facing them is necessary for people to experience healing and to experience wholeness. Therefore, caring for feelings is an incredibly important part of becoming a Stephen minister. But how can you help people find the courage they need to face their feelings? Well, I think the greatest example is let's look to Jesus. In Jesus, God became one of us. He shared the feelings that we experience. He loved his family. He enjoyed a wedding celebration. He felt the satisfaction of what a hard day of working was like and what it was to be full from eating. But he also suffered the most painful feelings that people will ever have. He knew what it was like to be rejected, isolated, and hated. As a result, we can be sure that there is no feeling that we can ever suffer in this life that God doesn't already understand. He's been there. He knows what we're experiencing. He shares our feelings and gives us courage to live through them. Well, the Bible tells you at the top of your outline and your focus notes at the beginning of this particular module on page 29, calls us to rejoice with those who rejoice and to mourn with those that mourn. When you do this, you let your care receivers know that they are not isolated or they're not trapped or they're not all by themselves in their feelings. They don't have to go through it alone. Your caring presence helps them to find the courage to face their feelings and receive the healing and wholeness that only God can offer. You probably know this will not always be easy. Sometimes people's painful feelings remind us of painful feelings we've had at one time. Other feelings may seem to hurt as much as they hurt them. Where will you find the courage to remain in the furnace of your care receiver's painful feelings? So look to Jesus. He promises to never leave or forsake you. He will be there for you. He will share the pain. He will give his gifts of healing and wholeness. But then look to one another, to your other fellow Stephen ministers. You will support and care for one another within the context of supervision groups later on. You'll help one another find the faith and the courage to stick with your caregiving, to stick with the process, even when the going gets tough. Rejoicing and mourning with your care receivers will be one of the most profound and rewarding experiences you will have as a Stephen minister. God will work through your caring presence to bring his care to your care receivers. Let me open us our time together that I'm going to teach today in prayer. We're going to be working from, I think, section 1, 4, maybe 5. I'll pick up a little bit as I get through the lecture with exactly what sections, but I know 1 and 4 for sure, and then we'll go from there. So let me open our time in prayer as I pray personally for you as you watch this lecture, as you listen to this lecture, as you interact on your end prior to getting together to meet with your particular groups as you work through the role plays involved with these modules. So let me pray for you right now. God, your word shows that you are full of feelings from compassion to wrath and to joy. When you created us in your image, you gave us feelings too. Thank you. We're grateful to you for that. We rejoice in your love for us, and we want to love you back. We hope and trust that you will be with us every step of the way on this caring journey. Receive our thanks and our praise for all your gifts, and especially now for the gifts of feelings. Amen. All right, so we're going to skip on over in your book as you follow along to section 4, which is a model for dealing with feelings. If you can imagine a pot that is sitting on a stove, it's under boiling heat, that's a lot like what our feelings are as they're cooking over an open fire. There's feelings inside the person, just like there's food inside the pot. The hotter the fire under the pot, the more intense the feelings get. And as steam forms inside the pot, it's got to get out. It has to escape somehow. In that same way, feelings have to get out from us somehow, some way. Otherwise, the person is going to blow their top. They're going to blow up. So in order to keep the pot from losing its lid, you need a plan for how to deal with feelings. And that's going to be what we move through now in Roman numeral 4 in your book, A Model for Dealing with Feelings. All right, so under letter A, there's really a 4-step process that I would want to describe and convey to you for dealing with feelings that helps us release pent-up feelings before they build up so much pressure that they can cause damage. The steps are recognize, accept, express, and trust. Let me hit this again. Recognize, accept, express, and trust. These 4 steps describe a process that you can help care receivers use and that you can also use to deal with your own feelings. So let's talk about recognize first. The first step is to recognize that a feeling is there. Sometimes that's easy. You clearly feel happy. You clearly have an emotion that shows on your cuff. You're aware of that fact. But sometimes recognizing a feeling is unavoidable. You're sobbing uncontrollably. It's obvious to everyone around you that it's there. So recognition of that becomes very easy. However, it's not always that easy to recognize a feeling. Sometimes feelings really hurt and people push them away so that they don't have to experience the pain. Most of the time, people really don't understand or realize that they're doing this to themselves. And if you pointed it out to them, they might disagree with you and tell you that you're wrong. When people suppress or push away their real feelings, that would be called denial. People might even deny enjoyable feelings, perhaps, because a person might not recognize feelings of love or affection that they've never had before because they're afraid of getting involved in a committed relationship. So pushing away or suppressing or denying feelings does not necessarily have to be a bad feeling. It can also be an enjoyable feeling that people choose to suppress. What are some of the clues that can help you recognize your care receiver's feelings? To help your care receiver recognize his or her feelings, it helps if you can recognize them. In the course of your caregiving, your care receiver may give you many clues about his or her feelings. Remember that people express feelings not only through words, but how they say those words, through their actions, and even through what they don't say as they sit silently. You can learn about a person's feelings from his or her tone of their voice, especially if the tone is different than normal. Someone who talks in a slow, deep voice may feel sad and depressed. While somebody that speaks in a high-pitched voice and rapid speech and they get really excited are experiencing that, excitement, or maybe even nervousness. Unusually loud speech, anger, or maybe a softer than normal voice may mean I don't have enough confidence in what I'm saying, so I'm going to say it softer so that maybe everybody won't hear it. Well, what if you were talking to a care receiver who said, everything's great, really, nothing's bothering me? As a person said this, however, you could see him or her wringing their hands. Yeah, I'm great. No, man, there's nothing wrong. Well, would you believe that there was nothing wrong? Certainly the care receiver's behavior doesn't give you permission to call the person a liar, but it does invite you in to explore what's really going on. This could be an example of what's called a cover opposite, where the person's claim to happiness covers his or her real anxiety. Incongruities are another hint that helps you understand what your care receiver may be feeling. Incongruities occur when a person's external behavior does not match what he or she is actually feeling. If your care receiver's actions, facial expressions, tone of voice doesn't match what they're saying, be aware, because that may mean that your care receiver has feelings that they're denying. Another kind of incongruity may be when your care receiver says something that doesn't match what he or she said last week or last month. For example, a care receiver might say they're really worried about their child, but then a week later say everything is just fine and he or she is feeling no concern at all about this child. It certainly could be possible that the situation or the circumstances have changed, but it also could be a sign that the care receiver is even more worried and is afraid to recognize the feelings about his or her child. At times, a care receiver may show strong feelings about a person by refusing to talk about him or her. This refusal might also be more subtle. Instead of saying he or she won't talk about a person, the care receiver may just change the subject whenever that person comes up in conversation. The way a person moves or carries themselves can also communicate feelings. Some examples of body language are slumped shoulders, hanging one's head, or looking down all the time, or maybe even jumping up and down with excitement. So how can you help your care receiver recognize his or her feelings? Well, suppose a Stephen minister said to a care receiver, you may not realize it, but you're feeling sad. If you say you aren't, you're just denying the truth. How well do you think that would work? I think the answer is clear. People don't appreciate it when others act like a know-it-all, even if the know-it-all is correct. Actually, especially if the know-it-all is correct. But trying to tell or convince a care receiver that he or she has hidden feelings is not a caring gesture at all. It won't work. It is much more useful to help a care receiver discover their feelings for themselves. And a great technique for helping others to see their own feelings more clearly is doing what's called reflecting back their feelings that you are recognizing in them. To recognize or to reflect is to summarize and say back what the care receiver's already said. If you'll pay attention to Focus Note 2, which is on page 30 of your training manual, you'll see a couple of examples of what that reflecting might look like. Let me read that through to you. So as you look at Focus Note 2, page 30. So the care receiver says, I don't know what we're going to do about Matt. He doesn't listen to us, and he's getting in with the wrong crowd at school. The Stephen minister then responds back, it sounds as if you're worried about Matt and afraid of what could happen to him. That's one scenario. Next one is the care receiver says, every time I try to forget about Angie, she turns up in my life again. And when I get all mixed up inside, I know it's over between us, but I can't stop thinking about her. And the Stephen minister then responds in this case, as I listen to you, I'm wondering if you still have strong feelings for Angie. So you see how that reflecting works in those two examples? You'll learn much more about reflecting in the next module, Module 3, when we talk about the art of listening. You might also be able to help your care receiver recognize his or her feelings by gently pointing out incongruities that you have noticed. Focus Note 3 gives you an example of that. Let me read through that as well while you look at that in your book. Focus Note 3. Stephen minister, you talk about being happy with your relationship with Eddie, but just before you mentioned him, you breathed a deep sigh and your face took on a very sad look. I wonder what that might mean. Or, Stephen minister says, last week when you mentioned your mother, you seemed so worried about her being in the nursing home. This week you don't seem to be as concerned. Has something changed in your mother's situation? All right, so that's kind of covers the topic of recognizing. Now let's talk about on letter B in your training manual, accept. Recognize, then accept. So after recognizing that feeling, the second step is to accept it and own the feeling, realizing that it's all right to have the feelings you have. Now again, sometimes this can be very easy, sometimes not so much. For example, a person may feel angry with someone and believe that he or she is perfectly justified in feeling that way. Other times, however, a person may feel angry at a loved one, at the same time also feel guilty for feeling angry. When a person says something like, I should not have this feeling, that's usually a sign he or she has not accepted that feeling. Now you know from your pre-class reading, I hope, that feelings aren't good or bad in and of themselves. They're neutral. What is important is what you do with them. When people judge feelings as bad or unacceptable, however, that's another way of denying those feelings. They won't be able to deal with the feelings or to release the pressure until they're able to accept them. One way that you can help your care receiver accept his or her feelings is for you to accept them and to accept your care receiver no matter what he or she feels. Suppose your care receiver were to admit to feelings of jealousy towards a rival or a loved one. If you responded with a look of shock or disapproval, your care receiver might take your reaction to mean that his or her feeling was bad or unacceptable. They also might be unlikely to share such personal feelings with you again. On the other hand, if you respond with acceptance, that might help your care receiver find the courage that it takes to take the next step in dealing with this difficult feeling that they're wrestling with. By accepting others' feelings, you are giving them permission to accept the feelings themselves. So recognition, accept. Now let's talk about express for just a minute. The third step in dealing with feelings is how to express them. You've read that people can express feelings in several ways, including verbally, physically, or perhaps in writing. Your job as a caregiver is to help your care receiver express feelings that he or she has recognized and accepted in an appropriate way that will work for him or her. Focus Note 4 on page 31 in your manual contains some ways in which you might encourage your care receiver to express feelings. Let's look at those right now. Focus Note 4. Assure your care receiver that it's okay to cry. Invite your care receiver to tell you more about his or her feelings and then listen carefully. And finally, suggest that your care receiver keep a diary or a journal in which he or she writes about their feelings. One thought to keep in mind is that while sometimes the process of recognize, accept, and express goes in that order, there are other times when the order might change. Sometimes a care receiver may say something about feeling a certain way and then sit back in surprise and say something like, I never knew I felt that way. In that case, expressing the feeling came before the recognition of it. A care receiver might also talk theoretically about such a feeling as fear. Once he or she came to the point of believing that it was okay to have such a feeling, or in other words, had accepted the feeling, then the care receiver could recognize his or her own fear that he or she had been feeling afraid all along. All right, recognize, accept, express, and then finally, trust. The final step in dealing with feelings is to wait and trust. Although it will take time for care receivers to deal with their feelings, it helps to trust the process and to have hope that God will indeed bring healing. God works through those 4 steps to bring his gift of healing. Just as a gardener plants, waters, and weeds, it is God who mysteriously makes the plants grow. So Stephen ministers help care receivers recognize feelings, accept them, and express them. But it's God who brings about healing and wholeness. These 4 steps add up to an excellent way to deal with feelings, but Stephen ministers and care receivers place their trust in God to work his miracle of bringing new life. Okay, so that kind of concludes that particular section. Again, as you come together in your groups to do our particular role play exercises, we'll cover some of the material that I'm skipping through now. And I'm going to pick up now with Roman numeral 6 in your book. Roman numeral 6 is entitled The Mud Hole. Now, empathy is one of the most important skills that a Christian caregiver can use. Focus Note 7 on page 32 contains a definition of empathy. Let me take a moment and just read Focus Note 7 to you. Empathy is the ability to sense the client's private world as if it were your own, but without ever losing the as-if quality. Let me read that again. Empathy is the ability to sense the client's private world as if it were your own, but without ever losing the as-if quality. Okay, you'll see in some of the material that you have online a picture of what's called the mud hole diagram, and I want you to refer to that. You may not be able to click over there right now while watching this, but at some point I want you to look over at the mud hole diagram, and hopefully what I talk through now will make sense as you look at that. Now, Carl Rogers said empathy is the ability to experience the feelings that another person is experiencing without losing touch with your own reality as a separate individual. All right, so when we look at this mud hole diagram, what you're going to see is that people have problems and difficulties in life. We know that. That's a given. So let's compare those problems or difficulties to being stuck in a mud hole. And as the care receiver in the diagram, I'm going to talk you through some of the different ways that caregiving looks like. On your end, people might relate to a care receiver who's stuck in the mud. They've got problems, they've got difficulties, really with 3 different orientations. Those would be sympathy, over-identification, or empathy. All right, so let's talk about sympathy for a minute. This is letter A under Roman numeral 6. So the sympathy figure is, as you're looking at the diagram of the mud hole, the sympathy figure is the one that's way over on the left-hand side, kind of on the edge, looking down into the hole. Okay? Focus Note 9 gives you a definition of sympathy. Sympathy is feeling concern for someone else without being involved in his or her life. So in the particular illustration you're looking at as the mud hole, the sympathy figure is standing at the edge of the mud hole, looking down, feeling sorry for the care receiver. The sympathetic person, although concerned, remains apart from the care receiver who's down in the hole. He or she does not establish what I would call a close, caring relationship. Now, there's absolutely nothing wrong with sympathy in and of itself. Certainly there are times when we hear about others' pain, but all we can do is feel sorry for the victims and pray for them. For example, several years ago when the earthquake happened in Haiti, you certainly hear about that. You sympathize with them. You pray for the Haitian people. However, in most of our cases, there was not a lot we could do to really get into the mud hole with them to help solve their problem. In your relationships that you develop with care receivers, being sympathetic is not going to be enough. Your care receivers are going to need more than that from you. Sometimes your care receivers will need you to share their feelings, to help them carry a heavy load of sadness, anger, or despair. Sometimes your care receivers will need you to get in the mud with them so that you can know they're not alone. Letter B talks about over-identification. Now, it is possible to overdo getting in the mud with your care receiver. Over-identification is the opposite of sympathy. While sympathy means remaining emotionally aloof from the care receiver, over-identification, as you see defined in Focus Note 10, means getting emotionally enmeshed with the care receiver. So let's read Focus Note 10 together. Over-identification means taking on the care receiver's feelings and characteristics to the point that the caregiver is just as overwhelmed as the care receiver is. So in this particular illustration, an over-identification figure jumps down into the mud hole, gets just as muddy as the care receiver, and therefore is just as stuck. The over-identification figure in the drawing that you see is the second one from the left. They're down in the mud. So for example, if a care receiver hears that a loved one has been involved in an accident and then becomes hysterical, it doesn't help if the Stephen minister identifies with the care receiver so much that he or she also becomes hysterical. When caregivers over-identify, they lose themselves in the caring relationship. They no longer have the objectivity that they need for good caring to take place. With over-identification, the care receiver may experience a sense of companionship, but that's not enough. The care receiver still does not have any way to get out of the mud hole. Now, while it may be true that misery loves company, misery needs more than just company for true Christian caregiving to take place. All right, so C is empathy. That's the person over on the right. The most caring and helpful orientation is empathy. Let's look at Focus Note 11 as it defines empathy. Empathy is feeling another's problems as if they were your own without actually taking them on yourself. Empathy involves getting inside another person's skin or walking in the shoes of someone else without losing oneself in the care receiver pain or trouble. In the illustration that you see there with the mud hole, the empathic caregiver gets into the mud hole with the care receiver, but at the same time is hanging onto the root of the tree at the side. Empathic caregivers get personally involved while maintaining control of themselves in the caring relationship. At any time they wish, they can hoist themselves out of the mud by hanging onto that tree. Moreover, by holding onto the tree with one hand and extending the other hand to help the care receiver, empathic caregivers have the leverage they need to help their care receivers climb out of the mud hole. Empathy, then, is the excellent orientation to assume in your caring relationships. You feel some of the care receiver's pain. You may even shed tears, but you firmly hang on to your own reality and sense of self. You are fully involved, but at the same time, you become a stable support for your care receivers as they work through their particular problems and challenges. Since we are Christian caregivers, it's important to add the most important layer of meaning to the mud hole diagram.